So there's been a Q&A going over the Gojo versus Sukuna fight, and honestly there's only really one thing that we got out of this. Specifically, there's really only one thing that we got from Gege Akutami about this Gojo versus Sukuna fight. And to no one's surprise, this reignited the Gojo versus Sukuna battle. Debates about who would be winning, who would have won, what could have happened, basically the same discourse that was happening 2 years ago when this battle was taking place. So of course, in this video, I'll be kind of going over what Gege said in that kind of Q&A. And obviously, for the most part, as most of you know, these are rough translations, as I'm getting these from Miyamura, someone I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So just bear with me and take this with a grain of salt. Don't try to take this too serious, at least until we get official translations of the whole Q&A, because more than likely there is going to be some missing context. So with that in mind, let's get right into what was said by Gege about this Gojo and Sukuna fight. Okay, so this is from Miyamura, and it states, Gege says the biggest factor for Gojo's defeat is that Gojo let his guard down, and follows up with what is basically a rough translation of what Gege Akutami said himself, which is, and I quote, "After defeating Mahoraga, Gojo thought that Sukuna had no way to bypass his infinity anymore. I think that the usual Gojo would have sensed that something was amiss and could have avoided a fatal wound." Okay, so with these translations, many people are saying that this basically means that if Gojo would have locked in more, or if Gojo had been paying attention, Gojo could have dodged Sukuna's attack and actually went on to eventually win the fight. While there's even some people saying that this Q&A itself reinforces the idea that Gege didn't know what to do with Gojo. And while I myself wouldn't go as far as to say something that preposterous, you would be lying if you said that what Gege is saying here doesn't change anything. Because what do you mean he wasn't locked in? What do you mean I think the usual Gojo would have sensed something was amiss? What is the usual Gojo? Because the last time I checked, the usual Gojo is the Gojo that falls to tricks and has on many occasions been outwitted by the likes of Kenjaku and Toji. Hell, Gojo couldn't have even been in prison if it wasn't for him falling to Kenjaku's plan and basically getting caught lacking. And what this really boils down to is just that in the context of the fight, Gojo wasn't expecting Sukuna to use a binding vow, which personally to me makes zero sense, because he knows that Sukuna had to use a binding vow in order to get Megumi's body. He may not know what Sukuna did, but that's why he specifically asked way earlier in the series about if Sukuna had spoken to Yuji about something while he was dead, because he knew that Sukuna was liable to probably pull some kind of binding vow in order to, twist and plan nefarious things for his own agenda. So for Gojo to basically rule out binding vows from Sukuna of all people, not only does it not make much sense, but it also seems kind of inconsistent in terms of Gojo's character, and personally just paints him to be less intelligent than Gojo is actually portrayed to be. Because while yes, Gojo has gotten got a few times in the series, he's always been portrayed to be a character that learns from his mistakes and not fall for the same thing twice. For example, his defeat to Toji led to him developing his automatic infinity, while his defeat to Kenjaku led to him going straight to Kenjaku to finish him off, as if you can recall, his hesitation is what led to him being imprisoned in the first place. So even if we're talking in the case of Gojo versus Sukuna, where Sukuna had used Mahoraga to cut off Gojo's arm, I'd say it's pretty arguable even then that Gojo could be aware of the possibility of Sukuna using Mahoraga's abilities, or in this case, Mahoraga's formula. And so while I do want people to keep in mind that I do feel that Sukuna can defeat Gojo at the end of the day, at least, full form Sukuna can, I really don't like this idea that Gojo at this point in the fight especially was caught off guard and he could have dodged it. In fact, I actually prefer that it was left up to the readers, or I should say the reader's interpretation of the fight, whether or not Gojo could sense that last slash, because I thought that it was pretty established that Gojo couldn't really sense the slashes, at least the way that, you know, like Maki could or something. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I don't really disagree with the fact that Gojo would, at the end of the day, probably lose this fight, but I would be lying if I did say it didn't change anything, that Gojo just wasn't paying enough attention. If not for the reasons I've already said, for the simple fact that we had actually never seen Gojo this locked in. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I do think Gege is either trolling us or he like hates interviews, because he does give us some, you know, bare bones answers, or he gives us answers that we really have to think, or he gives us ambiguous, you know, ideas of, I don't know, what it could be. So that's pretty much all I had to say. Just a quick, you know, something to start a discussion. If you really like today's video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Yeah, I will see you guys later.